So today's sermon I titled, "We, the Body of Christ, Have COVID-19," after a sermon given at MCC San Francisco on March 10, 1989 by Reverend Russell Coons, which he titled his sermon, "We, the Body of Christ, Have AIDS." And I'll explain a little bit more as I go on. But on March 10, 1989, Reverend Ron Russell Coons preached his iconic sermon, "We, the Body of Christ, Have AIDS," at MCC Church in San Francisco. As many of my congregant members know and have experienced, 1989 was at the peak of the AIDS crisis, and MCC churches around the country have become a hub for the LGBTQ+ community and the AIDS community to gather to mourn and celebrate the lives that the epidemic took daily. While I, as a Gen Zer, am too young to fully understand the extent of the indescribable pain that the AIDS crisis caused for our community, I devoted many years in college studying AIDS history, art, and activism, eventually writing my senior thesis on MCC San Francisco and its AIDS ministry through this very sermon by Reverend Russell Coons. In this specific sermon, "We, the Body of Christ, Have AIDS," Reverend Russell Coons' last sermon before his death due to AIDS complication, Reverend Russell Coons laid out AIDS theology and what it meant to be a unified body, Church of Christ, specifically when parts of our Christian body had AIDS. As you can imagine, this idea was radical during this time as conservative Christians were creating an us versus them mentality with the AIDS community as they wrongfully and ignorantly justified AIDS as God's wrath on homosexuality. In our current times, I have heard older gay men talk about how similar COVID-19 feels like the AIDS crisis. When people finally understood the severity of COVID-19 in March, I remember having discussions with some of my gay professors who survived the AIDS crisis about how the current times have brought back painful reminders of what it was like to live during the epidemic. My mentor at the Divinity School especially was recounting the horrible flashbacks of living in fear and seeing people of their own community die in huge numbers daily, and the government's failure to place thoughtful policies to help solve the crisis in hand. While I am not trying to compare COVID-19 to the AIDS epidemic, as HIV activists like Mark King writes in HIV Plus magazine that the two public health crises cannot be compared, as during the AIDS epidemic, the government actually ignored and remained silent for years while hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives due to AIDS complication. COVID-19 feels familiar to many members of our community because it brings back painful reminders of the horrifying injustices and fear that comes with living through a pandemic and being an LGBTQ+ person in our heteronormal world. This week, as I felt a deep sense of panic and anxiety while catching up on all the bad news in our country and our world, I couldn't help but be reminded of this sermon by Reverend Russell Coons, because in a time where we are once again faced with a public health crisis, which in fact impacts our most vulnerable community, like the LGBTQ+ community, religions like Christianity seems to create false narratives as a mechanism to divide the people and create conflict to further political campaigns. Does anyone else get really angry, frustrated, and annoyed when anything bad happens in America? Conservative Christians blame it on the LGBTQ+ community. They especially like to use passages like Sodom and Gomorrah incorrectly to further their political agendas. Well, much like during the AIDS crisis, where people like Jerry Falwell incorrectly used Sodom and Gomorrah to further harmful narratives around queer people, Ralph Drollinger, one of Trump's spiritual advisors, actually been deploying the same overused tactics to blame COVID-19 on the LGBTQ+ community. But outside of this, the Republicans in our country are blatantly racist, homophobic, classist, and support hatred and injustice in the name of our Bible. What we saw happen during the AIDS crisis and what is currently happening in our world in COVID-19 is in fact not a Christian concept. Dividing the people through cherry-picking different passages is just wrong. Using the Bible to create an us versus them is not Christian, and Reverend Russell Coons knew this back in 1989, and I know this now during COVID in 2020. Instead, Christianity calls for a unified body, one that works together, honors one another, and depend on each other. We see this theology through our Bible reading today, where Paul gives us the metaphor of the church, or Christianity at large, being part of a unified body. In the Queer Bible Commentary, Holly Heron explains that Paul wrote the Corinthian letter and this specific passage to the Corinth church to help the congregation understand their struggles with different theologies. Corinth was a part of a major trade route long time ago and was considered a cosmopolitan center with ethnically and religiously diverse people. Due to the diversity of identities that exist in the Corinthian church, Paul wrote his letters as a way to teach the new church on how to create unity. Paul wrote the specific metaphor of the body of Christ because the Corinth church struggled with unification and began creating divisions amongst themselves. The division was created due to hierarchies of beliefs, creating different status symbols which rank the needs of the members. Paul immediately dismisses these tensions by instilling a corporate identity in which everyone contributes to the unity of the body, yet are individually different. Paul uses different examples of the human body, such as the eyes, ears, head, and hands, to explain how each part is needed to make the whole body function. With this metaphor, Paul sought to create a unified Corinthian church, which every person contributes to the workings of the church without dismissing other members. Paul's metaphor is about interdependence, a unity which is dependent upon a self-conscious recognition of and celebration of diversity. For some reason, the acceptance of diversity continues to be a challenge in our faith community, even in the modern day, especially when conservative Christians are still excluding LGBTQ+ people, Black people, and poor people from their communities, theologies, and churches. Yet, Paul writes that God created each member purposely and that we all contribute to the larger workings of the body. No one can be left behind. To continue to reject marginalized members is just flat out incorrect. So let us look at verses 21 to 25. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts needs no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lack it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. Again, let's imagine this theology, the verses that I just read, being deployed in our country today. People would wear masks because it honors those who are most vulnerable. Politicians would stop harassing trans people by attempting to strip them of their rights, but instead treat them like humans. Republicans would stop doing everything that they can to not acknowledge the structural racism in our country and instead honor the Black community and the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the thousands of other Black people who die in the hands of our police. Paul ends this passage with, if one part suffer, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Back in 1989, when Reverend Russell Coons was preaching his last sermon and laying out the foundations of AIDS theology, he was pleading to the Christian community that they needed to recognize that MCC the LGBTQ+ community, and those living with AIDS were part of the unified body of Christ and that they were hurting. They needed support as thousands of hundreds of people were dying daily. I want to conclude by quoting the conclusion of Reverend Russell Coons' sermon given in March '89, but I will replace the word AIDS with COVID-19 because as a unified Christian body, we are once again faced with a challenge where we are divided. In the words of Reverend Russell Coons, he states, "The crisis of COVID-19 is our crisis. It is not a we-they issue. The church must share in this experience, changing and being changed, so that to enable society to provide a supporting presence for those who are grieving and suffering. We have COVID-19. Faced with the urgency of COVID-19, we as a global community recognize our brokenness and common need for healing and reconciliation. We as a community must continue to struggle towards genuine acceptance of and respect for each individual person. To do this, we must overcome prejudice and discrimination. We are not called to be judgmental. We are called to be a healing church. We believe that all people are equal before God." It's so crazy to me that these words are still so relevant today. I decided to revisit Reverend Russell Coons' sermon this week because I needed the strength to stand here in front of my congregation and to the larger Christian body to plead that we must continue the fight for equality and acceptance no matter how hard and tough it may seem. People like Reverend Russell Coons and George Floyd died unjustly in the hands of those who did not see them as equals. We, as parts of the unified body of Christ, must continue to remind the different parts of our faith community that we need to be treated with honor and respect, while also being compassionate to those who are also different from us. For only then we can begin to build up a better world, one in which we can all live safely. Thank you.